Japan has been a prominent country in the Asia-Pacific region, especially for the aviation industry. A prime example of this is that Japan is home to two of the prominent and most recognized airlines around the world, the first being All Nippon Airways, or ANA for short. The other airline is Japan Airlines, which has been considered as the flag carrier of the country. Similar to ANA, it is also one of the oldest operating airlines in the country right now, with a long legacy which has coincided with the rise of Japan as an economic power in the post-World War II era. However, while the two airlines had a similar start, Japan Airlines would become the leading international airline of the country, going further to become the top airline of the world. With its great rise, it also had a great fall which threatened the very existence of the airline itself. This is all part of the history of Japan Airlines, the subject of this video. The story of Japan Airlines begins in post-World War II Japan, as Allied forces were part of the rebuilding process for the country. In terms of airlines, there were some initiatives by the Japanese government, though Japan Airlines initially started off as a private entity. In 1951, a group of prominent Japanese investors founded the airline as a domestic carrier and set up an office in Tokyo. This would lead Japan Airlines to becoming the first civil aviation service in the country after the war. However, the group needed help, and that help came from several foreign airlines. One of the first airlines was Philippine Airlines, which lent the then startup airline Japan Airlines a DC-3 aircraft which would be used for 3 days for invitation-only flights around Tokyo during August 1951. Later on, another airline, Northwest Airlines, would begin offering training for a flight crew, and with the lease of 5 Martin 202 aircraft, Japan Airlines received the initial fleet for its first operating flights. So with that, the first official Japan Airlines flight took place on October 25, 1951, connecting Tokyo and Osaka with a stop at Fukuoka along the way. Later on, the airline would acquire DC-4 aircraft on its own as it added Sapporo and Iwakuni to its domestic operations. Eventually, by 1953, Japan Airlines would graduate its first set of homegrown trained pilots, as there were several other competing airlines that were starting to form at this time. As Japan Airlines continued to grow, one of the biggest events in Japanese aviation history occurred, which would change the course of Japan Airlines history. That very event was the passing of the Japan Airlines Act by the Japanese government in 1953, which very much nationalized the flag carrier. While it continued to operate domestic flights along with its other counterparts, Japan Airlines would be the sole carrier from the country to operate international flights. With that, the first international scheduled flights operated by Japan Airlines took place in 1954, connecting Tokyo and San Francisco via Wake Island and Honolulu. By the end of the 1950s, Japan Airlines was serving cities such as Hong Kong, Bangkok, Singapore, Los Angeles, and Seattle. This would continue into the 1960s as Japan Airlines expanded further into its first flights to Europe, connecting Tokyo and Hamburg and Paris, which made a stop in Anchorage, Alaska. As Japan Airlines was looking for more opportunities, it welcomed the jet age with its first jets in the 1960s, welcoming the DC-8 aircraft to its fleet. During this era, the airline added destinations such as New Delhi, Amsterdam, New York, and London. As the post-World War II era Japan was seeing an economic growth, the airline launched its first venture, JAL Pack, which gave travel packages for the growing middle class of Japanese. It was also during this decade that Japan Airlines operated its first around-the-world flight and added the Boeing 727, the first of many Boeing jets that the airline would eventually operate. While it was acquiring US-made jets, Japan Airlines also welcomed the YS-11, the first homegrown Japanese-made aircraft, towards the end of the 1960s. Before long, it would become the 1970s, and by then, Japan Airlines welcomed the big jets, the Boeing 747s, to its fleet, along with the cargo version of the aircraft. After the introduction of the 747s, DC-10 aircraft would be introduced to the airline's fleet in 1976. In 1978, another event, the opening of Narita Airport, would change the course of Japan Airlines and international travel to and from Japan. After using Haneda Airport near central Japan for much of its history, international flights were shifted to Narita. For its first international flight from Narita, Japan Airlines operated a flight to Guam via Saipan. Following the opening of Narita Airport, Japan Airlines further expanded its international network with flights to Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. As Japan Airlines' network was becoming bigger, So too was the profile of the airline, and arguably this period could have been the peak time for the airline. During this time, Japan Airlines was being recognized for its in-flight services, and along with that, it was recognized as a top airline for international services. In terms of additions to its fleet, Japan Airlines added the 747SR, the short-range but high-capacity variant of the 747 aircraft. Equipped with 550 seats, it met Japan Airlines' needs for high capacity in high-traffic domestic routes. Following the 747SR, the Boeing 767 was introduced to the fleet in the mid-1980s. Beyond the airline business, Japan Airlines further expanded its business ventures. Following the launch of JAL Pack decades earlier, Japan Airlines invested in hotels and real estate, which included the JAL building in New York City's Fifth Avenue. While it became one of the more prominent and powerful companies around the world, the 1980s would see signs of decline of the airline. The airline's image was tarnished with the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123, which was the worst crash in Japanese aviation history. Then, towards the late 1980s, the Japanese economy hit a recession, leading to what has been called as a lost decade for the country. Adding another wrench to the growing situation of Japan Airlines, the skies of Japan were being liberalized, with the Japanese government opening up the international flights to other airlines such as its competitor, ANA. For the first time in decades, Japan Airlines would have domestic competition on international flights. The airline was privatized and its corporate structure was changed. With the initial pains for Japan Airlines in the late 1980s, it would build up into the 1990s, and while Japan Airlines welcomed new aircraft such as the Boeing 747-400 and the MD-11, the problems of losses continued to mount for the airline. After the Japanese recession in the late 1980s, there were other recessions in other countries, leading to the Great Asian Financial Crisis in 1997. Still, Japan Airlines would carry on into the 2000s, which would see some good and bad developments for the airline. In 2002, Japan Airlines integrated Japan Air System, the third busiest airline in the country at the time, as part of a merger. Following the merger of Japan Air System into Japan Airlines, the airline would join the One World Alliance in 2007 and continued its push for developing in-flight amenities amid its financial situation. However, despite cuts over the years in the 1990s and 2000s, Japan Airlines had not been able to manage its situation, leading to the crisis that threatened the very existence of Japan Airlines itself. From the late 1980s to the 2000s, Japan Airlines ventures and the starting of some which could be described as unsustainable routes followed up with the airline. The situation would be made even worse with the global financial crisis of 2008. Counting its losses, Japan Airlines would count a debt of around $25 billion. With a high amount of the financial liabilities and questionable management of the airline, many doubted the future of the airline as the airline declared bankruptcy. With that, it was one of the biggest corporate failures in Japanese history. As we know, the story ends with the rehabilitation of the airline, but this will give you an overview of what had happened, which actually is one of the more interesting stories in aviation in Asia. To start, some of the key criticisms of Japan Airlines and its financial situation at the time went deeper than just the financial situation, but also the fundamental business management of the airline. With that, the Japanese government stepped in and led the Reorganization Task Force, which consisted of some of the prominent business minds of the country, to help turn around what was considered a symbol of the country. One of the members of this task force was Kazuhiko Toyama, who happened to share his thoughts in an article titled The Real Story of the Problems at Japan Airlines, originally published in the Japanese publication The Voice in June of 2010 and had been translated on Global Asia. In his article, Toyama mentioned the combination of short-term and long-term issues that plagued the airline. He also wrote about just how dire the situation the airline was in, stating that 200 billion Japanese yen would be needed within a year after the Japanese government established a rehab team in 2009 in order for the airline to continue operation. He particularly cited the large legacy costs, overbloated with planes, personnel, and routes, particularly unprofitable routes, the airline was operating. Specifically, he did refer to the large reliance on the big jets such as the 747s from Tokyo's Narita airports where flight slots are limited, a factor contributing to the cost of the airline. He then also cited the historically aggressive practices in hiring, as the airline currently had at the time 50,000 employees, further adding that figure was 30% more than what was needed. Another issue he identified was the dynamics of veterans and young employees, saying, quote, "Although JAL has been known for its aggressive recruitment in the past, it decreased the number of new hires starting in 1975 as the industry became more competitive and the company faced a business downturn. This caused a reverse pyramid effect in the company's human resource structure, with too many veterans and too few young employees." Toyama also added that the cost-cutting that the airline had taken prior did not take into account of the large benefits for retired and existing employees of the airline, while continuing the aggressive recruiting practices. While the airline was privatized in 1987, Japan Airlines continued to see a mix of corporate culture between politics and business, with some of the old habits sticking around, and with that, the airline management denied reality. With a need for the change of culture from the top down of Japan Airlines, the reorganization team turned to someone with a more philosophical approach to become the new CEO of the airline. The person they selected was Kazuo Inamori, who just happens to be a trained Buddhist monk. Now at first you might think this is a very odd and questionable selection, but Inamori does have a business acumen, having been the founder of tech company Kyocera. Reflecting on his initial thoughts during his first days with the company, Kazuo was quoted in a BBC report in 2012 saying, quote, "It felt very uncomfortable because the company didn't feel like a private firm at all." With a tall task to turn around Japan Airlines, Kazuo did something more personal. Instead of just making immediate cuts, based on his experiences with Kyocera, he issued a small booklet of his business philosophies in a mandatory staff meeting named the JAL Philosophy. Kazuo recounts that he was initially met with skepticism from the Japan Airlines staff. Eventually, he would win over the staff with some more sit-downs, with the help of some beer. While establishing the connection with the staff was one thing, the hard task of turning around the airline was another. As the Japanese government provided 100 million yen in aid, Inamori would oversee some major structural changes for the airline. The overall workforce, as Toyama mentioned, was one-third over the needed amount, was actually reduced by that amount. The overall management structure saw the reduction of executive power, while giving more decision-making power to the lower-level supervisors. Japan Airlines would ask to write off debts of over 500 billion yen, and the airline would eliminate some of the costly aircraft, including the Boeing 747s, for more fuel efficiency. As a result, by the end of the fiscal year 2012, Japan Airlines actually recorded a net profit. As part of the restructuring, Japan Airlines sought for ways to reduce its costs while improving its operational efficiency. This would be the trend for the 2010s as Japan Airlines formed key strategic partnerships such as the joint ventures with American Airlines, British Airways, and Finnair. Replacing the Boeing 747, Japan Airlines now relies on Boeing 787 Dreamliners, and in the future, the Airbus A350s will be the future flagship aircraft of the fleet. To capitalize on opportunities in the budget airline segment, Japan Airlines formed a joint venture with Qantas to form Jetstar Japan. Then there's Zip Air Tokyo, a medium long-haul budget carrier using 787s. With the opening up of international flight slots at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, previously the domestic hub of the country of Japan, Japan Airlines is now able to take advantage of the dual airport system of Tokyo. At present, Japan Airlines currently operates hubs out of Tokyo's airports Narita and Haneda, along with Osaka's Itami and Kansai airports. The airline also has key focus cities in Nagoya, Fukuoka, and Sapporo. Along with the mainline operations, Japan Airlines also has a group of subsidiaries and joint ventures, which helps the group optimize its operations domestically and internationally. In all, Japan Airlines has a fleet of around 155 aircraft, including over 50 Boeing 787s, which make up the majority of the fleet, along with more than 50 Boeing 737s. Like many of its legacy airline counterparts, Japan Airlines has had a long rise to prominence, but it almost ended badly. However, with its rise again and comeback, it strikes a resemblance of the Japanese economy and the country overall in the post-World War II era. Probably the most interesting part of the story was Kazuo Inamori himself, as how he incorporated his business philosophy into the restructuring of JAL made this video much more enjoyable for me. On a side note, Inamori is a national business icon in Japan, not just because of the turnaround of Japan Airlines, but also his philosophy is very popular in Japan, but also he's developed a bigger following in other countries such as China. As for the restructuring, it's been more than a decade since that happened, and still there has been some discussion as to whether Japan Airlines should have received any government involvement. Meanwhile, the results speak for itself, and Japan Airlines' turnaround could be an example for other struggling legacy airlines in the region, who also happen to be going through their own restructuring programs right now. What are your thoughts on the history of Japan Airlines, and what did you find more surprising or more interesting? I'd definitely love to hear your take on this, but in the meantime, this has been Flights in Asia, highlighting the news and updates from the aviation and travel scene in the Asia Pacific. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.